Thank you so much, Razi. This has been an amazing morning, and the only complaint I have is that we're standing between you and lunch after a food panel. So we will keep this exciting. I can tell you that as a journalist, I work for Fox News, and I cover the Pentagon, and for the last 10 years I've been at the Pentagon. But from 1993 to 95, I was based in Islamabad, Pakistan as a young journalist. My husband was the AP bureau chief, and one of the first people I reached out to was my dear friend Shuja Nawaz, who gave me a list of a literal who's who of Pakistan, which included Anila Shah as the top of the list, Salman Shah, as well as Dr. Maliha Lodhi. So it has been so many years, a love affair with the hospitality that we were shown back 25 years ago when we were a young couple in Islamabad. So I'm very excited to be here today. I was asked my daughter to send me a photograph of the two paintings that hang in our living room. One is a Salima Hashmi that I bought 25 years ago, and the other is a Qudus Mirza hanging above our fireplace. So we remember our time in Pakistan every time we walk through our living room. And my good friend, the artist and architect Naeem Pasha, teases me because I used to eat dal chawal for breakfast at his home. So I'd like to introduce my panel here. Ambassador Olson was the ambassador from the United States to Pakistan from 2012 to 2015. He followed that fateful day in May 8 years ago when I was at the Pentagon. I slept all night the night of the bin Laden raid. He was our ambassador to Islamabad at a difficult time following that moment in history. And Shuja Nawaz is the author of the new book, The Battle for Pakistan, The Bitter U.S. Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood. He also previously wrote Cross Swords, Pakistan, Its Army, and the Wars Within. He's currently at the Atlantic Council and former director of the South Asia Center there. And then my guest, Madiha Afzal, has joined us from Washington. She's a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute and author of Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society, and the State. So, from the titles of those books, it looks like we have been in troubled times. And so I want to start with each of you. If we could go across and talk about the continuing challenges, but also the possibility for rapprochement right now. And if you could start, Shuja, and just bring us up to speed very quickly with a little history of the relationship between Washington and Islamabad from 2001 to 2012 when Ambassador Olson arrived, and then you can pick up from there, and then Madiha, if you can talk about the current moment and where do we go from here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the organizers of the Lahore Literary Festival for bringing us all together. As you recounted, my own life and work for the last decade plus has been focused on this relationship because I spent some 35 years researching my first book, which the steady thread throughout that was the U.S. Pakistan relationship. And I'm just going to put out some statements, and I hope that in the conversation that we have with the audience in particular, we'll be able to fill in some of the gaps, because everyone has his or her own history of this relationship that they abide by, whether they're American or Pakistani. And even within America and within Pakistan, there are different histories and how people view that. Everyone has a truth, and they refuse to budge. And blood has been spilt as a result of those arguments. So the French always have a word for it, and I think the French word misalliance, which has been captured by the English, and George Bernard Shaw had a play by that title, really captures the essence of this relationship. It's a marriage between unequal partners. It's also what I call a bitter friendship, because it's a friendship, but it's a friendship marked by recriminations. Each side thinks that the other side has been lying, and both are correct. Mm-hmm. And it is because of gaps in how the governments of the United States and Pakistan have behaved without taking into account the needs of their peoples, and particularly the people of Pakistan, that we've made mistakes. And so I'm just going to recount some of the instances which are worth remembering, and then I'll end on a quote from a gentleman who's now running for President of the United States, something that he said in 2008, and maybe that will be the springboard for Rick's comments on what happened and why. We've always had, since 1954, when the initial U.S. Pakistan dialogue began on military assistance to Pakistan, these promises and what was delivered and what was not delivered. So the U.S. gave money to Pakistan. They were supposed to fight the communists alongside Turkey. And the Pakistanis immediately took the money, built a huge army, and based it in Karia, which is near Kashmir, nowhere near the northern border of Iran, where they would have to do the fighting. And the Americans were quite happy with that. And they kept doing this, and Pakistan kept moving all the troops to the Indian border. And nobody complained till there was an India-Pakistan war, and then everything stopped. And all the Pakistanis will tell you that the Americans betrayed us. And all the Americans will tell you that the Pakistanis never really meant to assist us. And so there's that dialogue, the roller coaster went up and down. And if you look at the assistance that the United States has provided Pakistan, it's almost it resembles the Trumpian signature that we've all come to see on Fox News and other places when he signs his declarations. It's like a fever chart. It goes up and down and up and down. And all the high points are when Pakistan has military rule, and all the low points are when military rule ends. And suddenly we don't have a reason to be in that part of the world. Now, I say we, and sometimes I mean Pakistan and sometimes I mean America, because I'm a Pakistani American. And I take ownership of both sides, and I think having seen how the sausage has been made on both sides, I can talk with a little bit of authority about this. So then comes Afghanistan, and of course, the Soviet Union invades, we shovel a lot of money into Pakistan, and we build up this enormous intelligence apparatus called the ISI. We don't deal with the regular army. It's very little. There was some dialogue, and I've got notes from those meetings of people that participated in that dialogue, but most of the work was done through the ISI. And so we leave Pakistan with this enormously powerful institution, which was separate from the military in the sense that regular army officers didn't want to serve in the ISI. It was not considered above the salt. And then suddenly, once the Afghan war is done and the Soviets decide to leave under a well thought out plan, we decamp from the region and leave Pakistan with the detritus of the war and the so-called Kalashnikov culture, and an enormously militant organization that we, the Americans, built up with syllabus that was created here for the madrasas that produced these militants who were going to fight this Islamic jihad for us. And then once they turned against us, suddenly now they were the enemy. And so this has been part of the problem facing us. Comes Afghanistan again, 9/11, we decide to invade. We send a task force, a naval task force called Task Force 58. And this is from my new book. I've traced all those details. It's headed by a brigadier general named James Mattis. And Jim Mattis arrives and goes straight to the Joint Chiefs headquarters, and his principal liaison is a major general there. So a decision has been made at the highest level to have a relationship with the United States. President Musharraf is the be-all, end-all. He's a general, he's commanding the military, and he's the president. And they open everything up to the Americans. They get overflight rights, they get Pasni Air Base, they get Jacobabad Air Base, and other facilities and ground lines of communication. but they cannot invade Afghanistan successfully without Pakistan's support. And so Mattis, who is the first Marine to command a naval task force, arrives and sets up all the tactical arrangements directly with the military. There's no civilian involvement in this particular phase of the tactical operational level. And I've gone through all the documents, and when he thanks them, he thanks the general that he dealt with. And they come at night to Pasni. They're kept at Pasni Airfield during the day. At night, they're bused to Jacobabad, and then they're shipped over to a place called Forward Operating Base Rhino that becomes Camp Rhino, south of Kandahar. That was the only way the US could actually invade Afghanistan, because all they had were 6 CIA teams, and that wouldn't have been enough to conquer the country. And this is something that the Pakistanis remember, but now the Americans have forgotten. And this has been the other issue that I want to put on the table, and that is that in Pakistan, history runs very deep. And what I explained to my American friends is that the word in Urdu for yesterday is the same word as tomorrow, kal. And so there's a continuum that everyone follows and that they foster. Whereas in America, the future begins from today, and we tend not to remember the history, and particularly on the military side. You know, our State Department has institutional memory, but the military has a great turnover, and we don't remember the history. That's why, if you look at the Afghanistan war, we have lost the lessons of Vietnam and all the other conflicts that we have as Americans fought in. And in the period 2001 till now, we've had 19 commanders in Afghanistan, which is no way to run a war. The longest serving commander was Mick Nicholson, who was 2 years plus. And that's no way to treat a professional army or a professional military, that you throw them in and they learn the ropes, and then you throw them out because domestic situation changes. This is the other issue I want to lay on the table, that it's domestic needs and politics that divides the two countries. The president, whether it's Obama or Trump, is constantly looking over his shoulder at congressional elections, at presidential elections, and the local economy. In Pakistan, it's the government which is lying to its own people most of the time, due respect to my friend Madiha, but you know, she has been on both sides of the fence and knows as a journalist how difficult it is. And so we've had successive governments that have not told their own people the truth about what they're doing with the Americans. And they keep denying it, and so you have this rise of anti-Americanism, which has been fueled by government action or inaction. And finally, the point I want to make is that we make promises to each other that we have no intention of keeping. So let me end with my quote, if I may. This is a statement from a gentleman named Joe Biden. And this is from February 28th, 2008. And this is when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He had been to the region with my former boss, Chuck Hagel, who later became Secretary of State. And he also had John Kerry with him, who succeeded him as the chairman of, and then became Secretary of State also. And Biden says about the relationship between the United States and Pakistan in 2008, quote, "We must, number one, triple non-military assistance and sustain it for a decade. Two, give the new government, if it is formed consistent with democratic principles, a democracy dividend of $1 billion above this annual assistance to jumpstart progress. Number three, demand transparency and accountability in the military aid we continue to provide. And four, engage with Pakistanis on issues important to them rather than just on those topics of interest to us." End quote. There's a lot more that he says which is very relevant, but I think my question to people in Pakistan and in the United States would be, what have we done about this particular promise? And what can we do that will change the future of this relationship? Because it remains an important relationship, and we seem to be removing the people of Pakistan out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Shuja. Ambassador Olson, I'm curious about your perspective. You had a unique perspective and a unique time period. What was your viewpoint, and what were some of your frustrations? And give us a little sense of history from that period.
Thanks, Jennifer, and good afternoon and salam alaikum to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I had the privilege of attending the Lahore Literary Festival in Lahore when I was ambassador, and so it's great fun to do it in New York as well. And an honor to follow my friend Shuja, with whom I agree on just about everything.
Dangerous.
I think what I would like to do is start with, Jennifer alluded at the outset to the annus horribilis of U.S. Pakistan relations, which was 2011. And I don't need to remind this audience probably of the significant events, but it started with the Raymond Davis running amok on the streets of Lahore, and then the Abbottabad raid in May, which obviously looked very different to a Pakistani set of eyes as opposed to American. And finally, in November, the Salalah incident, in which tragically 24 Pakistani soldiers were killed by U.S. forces on the border. In response, Pakistan closed the ground line of communications, and the U.S. suspended coalition support funds and other forms of assistance, and we got into a real tit for tat. It was, to use the analogy that Shuja mentioned, it was sort of a downward trend on the roller coaster that somewhat bottomed out in 2011. But one thing that's important, and this will come back, the relationship was not actually broken. And one thing I would note in particular is that Pakistan never closed the airlines of communication between for U.S. forces to fly into Afghanistan and out. I was stationed in Kabul at the time, and we were all worried about whether we were going to starve to death. And I can assure you that the lettuce in the salad bar never was less than crisp the entire time of the GLOC closure, which indicates how much we are in fact reliant on the airlines of communication through Pakistan, as well as the northern distribution network. I went out in 2012. I was charged by President Obama with reset and rebalancing the relationship. And Jennifer called it a difficult time period. Actually, I had a pretty easy job because, to tell you the truth, both sides were committed to rebuilding the relationship after a period of great difficulty. Ambassador Lodi was a great help in that, as was my counterpart, Ambassador Gilani, in Washington. And I think with political will on both sides, we cleared away a lot of the irritants that had built up. And it would be kind of tedious to go through all the diplomacy. Let's just say that's what diplomats love to do, is improve bilateral relations. And if you have the political will on both sides to do it, you can do it. So by the summer of 2015, we'd reached probably the high point in our relationship, at the top of the roller coaster. But at that point, the underlying strategic divergences began to reappear. And there were two. And they happen to be the central concerns for the U.S. administration with regard to Pakistan. The first is the nuclear issue, and that's not a topic we can discuss at any great length in an open forum. But let me say that while the U.S. accepts the logic of Pakistan's strategic nuclear program, certain specific systems and programs are very problematic from the U.S. position. And the second point is on what could be called counterterrorism, but I think to be more candid would be the question of Pakistani support for militant proxies. Now let's disaggregate that a little bit. One of the great success stories of U.S.-Pakistan cooperation is the decimation of al-Qaeda between 2001 and roughly 2009. And that is something that probably is not given enough emphasis and credit in history. But with the decimation of al-Qaeda, and especially core al-Qaeda, the emphasis for the United States shifted to the Taliban, not surprisingly, because we were suffering casualties at the hands of the Taliban after the resurgence in 2005, 2006, and episodically the Kashmiri groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba principally, and Jaish-e-Mohammed. So by 2016, the end of the Obama administration, effectively the relationship was beginning to go down on the roller coaster again. And the key data, not so much publicly, but the key data point there is that in fact the F-16 sale collapsed in Congress, and that effectively signaled in some ways a freezing of security assistance. Then we have the Trump administration. Despite some initial warm words, the policy framework that affected Pakistan was announced in August of 2017, very much the handiwork of the then National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. You'll recall that the State Department was unfortunately at that point largely absent without leave because of divergence of views between the then Secretary Rex Tillerson and the President. But it included a tougher line in principle towards Pakistan, although most of the attention at the time was focused on the military dimension in Afghanistan and increasing authorities and troops. But the effect of on Pakistan of the South Asia policy really was implemented in a way by President Trump's tweet of January of 2018. And the subsequent decision to, in effect, suspend and effectively end security assistance, and particularly the coalition support funds, which are cash payments to Pakistan, very important. Now, some of us were skeptical about this at the time. I wrote a piece in the New York Times at that time, basically pointing out that we are, in fact, as long as we continue to be militarily involved in Afghanistan, dependent on Pakistan. Those airlines of communication, once again, are hugely important. And if one is in the position of fighting in landlocked Central Asia, one has no choice but to go through either Pakistan or Iran, and Iran is obviously off the table for the United States. Since last fall, I think we've seen more of a fulfillment of the actual South Asia policy, in particular a focus on Afghan reconciliation and support for a political settlement, with the appointment of the very vigorous Zalmay Khalilzad. That has, I think we are beginning to visualize an endgame for the Afghan conflict. And Zal, despite his previous history, has been quite effusive in his appreciation for the role that Pakistan has played in helping to facilitate the ongoing talks in Doha. And by the way, without getting deeply into that, I think it's safe to say that the U.S. Taliban portion of those talks is all but concluded. And what remains is the intra-Afghan dialogue and, importantly, the regional dialogue. So we're actually in a more promising place now for U.S.-Pakistan relations. The roller coaster is starting to go up again. U.S. government officials are quietly talking about ways that the bilateral relationship could be enhanced. Probably not in the ways that we've done in the past. I think, I disagree with Biden. Big civilian assistance, I think, is not on the cards, not least because this administration doesn't believe in huge levels of civilian assistance anywhere in the world, but for other reasons as well. But I'll just take a couple more minutes and sketch out where I think we might be the areas where we could see some convergence between the United States and Pakistan in terms of interest. Clearly, the first is an endgame in Afghanistan. Broadly, both sides want to avoid a chaotic, an increase in the chaos in Afghanistan, let's put it that way, and are working together well. In principle, countering militancy is an area where we could cooperate. Prime Minister Imran Khan's comments have been positively received, but let us be candid that those kinds of statements have been made before by Musharraf, by Zardari, by Nawaz Sharif, And the question will be, are those sentiments actually implemented? If they are, I think the possibilities will be quite good for the relationship. The big new element is China and the framing of U.S. policy. For much of the last 18 years, U.S. policy towards Afghanistan has been framed by our military intervention in Afghanistan, as Shuja laid out quite accurately. But I think in a few years, we are likely to be framing our foreign policy thinking in terms of the competition with China. Great power competition more generally, but certainly a competition with China. And the question is, will Pakistan, our relationship with Pakistan, be framed in terms of how we, the United States, are competing with China, particularly given CPEC. I think we'll get some early indications, but not necessarily definitive indications in how the Pakistan's relationship with the IMF and the ongoing discussions about a program there are played out. And then finally, just as always, the questions of civilian-military relations in Pakistan. They seem to be going quite well for now. But will it last? I think that in those, I'm sure everyone in this audience would have probably an interesting observation on that. So why don't I stop there?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. I do want to be cognizant of time because we do want to have a few questions. But Madiha, if you could pick up with some of the points that you'd like to articulate, but I'd also really like to ask you and the panel to look at the relationship and the potential relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Khan, because in some ways, I would argue that these are two men that might be quite similar and might have some common ground, and this might be a moment of rapprochement that if we don't act quickly, the door could close again. So if you could also frame your remarks with regards to these two leaders.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm very pleased to be here. It's wonderful to be at the LLF and to be on this very esteemed panel. And it's a tough act to follow with Ambassador Olson and Shuja. And I'm going to pretty much agree with everything that both of you have said. We're pretty much on the same page on sort of the view of history. And I'll just pick up on certain points that I want to articulate, and then sort of where do we go from here, and in particular, the two sort of, and many in this audience may bristle at this characterization, but sort of impulsive populists that we have in office on both sides in both Pakistan and the U.S. So Shuja put it beautifully in terms of the history of the two countries and the fact that each side has its own history. I want to sort of hone down on that point and the narratives that Pakistan and the U.S. have of each other and how they make it essentially impossible for a U.S. policy to have the effect that it desires on Pakistan, because Pakistan's narratives fundamentally differ from the U.S. And because they do so, Pakistan's policies and Pakistan's policy responses are never aligned with what the U.S. wants. So while they share the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, an objective view of it is a certain type of history, but each has sort of this unique historical amnesia when it comes to their own culpability and faults in the relationship. And so each blames the other for the problems in the relationship. And Shuja, of course, has pointed this out very nicely and very eloquently, but I think central to this was the 1980s and the Soviet-Afghan War and the creation of the Mujahideen. So America does not acknowledge how the 1980s have affected Pakistan's trajectory. And of course, Pakistan sees the 1980s and the Soviet-Afghan War, the creation of the Mujahideen, as central to its trajectory going forward and puts the blame on America for that. Pakistan, on the other hand, does not acknowledge its own agency in that war and in the creation of the Mujahideen. Steve Cole's Ghost Wars goes in great detail about sort of Zia's own decision-making and how much agency Pakistan actually had in the decision-making in that war. And Pakistan does not acknowledge any of that. Pakistani citizens don't, the government doesn't, and so the blame tends to fall on the US. I think the second sort of narrative that really defines the relationship is the narrative of abandonment post-1990. And the narrative of US abandonment of Pakistan post-1990. This is huge in Pakistan, and it affects its incentives enormously. So Pakistan will always distrust the US. Pakistan always hedges its bets when it comes to the US. And America sort of needs to, I think, understand better and acknowledge more how the fear of US abandonment has affected Pakistan and its incentives. And it's useful to see the cutting off of aid by the Trump administration in that context. The cutting off of aid is not a useful policy tool when it only reaffirms Pakistan's conception of the US as being a party that will betray it and that has betrayed it. So Pakistan, because of the insecurity it feels from the US, doubles down on what it sees as its strategic assets, the Haqqani network. And then, of course, the insecurity that it feels from its eastern border in India, it doubles down on what it sees as its strategic assets there, the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed. And the US has some role to play in the insecurity Pakistan feels from India as well, in Pakistan's view, though that insecurity has its own roots, of course. But the US's role lies in what Pakistan and Pakistanis see as preferential treatment of India relative to Pakistan. So if you look at polling data, as I have in my book, the majority of Pakistanis will say that Pakistan treats the US treats India much more favorably than Pakistan, and a very small number will say the other. So those are sort of the narratives in some ways that have defined the relationship. There's a strain of anti-Americanism, as has been pointed out, that runs through the relationship and sort of has there are two kinds of anti-Americanism. There's sort of the sovereign nationalist argument, the argument that the U.S. sort of uses Pakistan expediently and then sort of rids itself of it when it doesn't need it. The narratives of sort of drone strikes, the Osama bin Laden raid, violating Pakistan's sovereignty, cutting off of aid, all of those fall in that narrative, and that sort of feeds into this anti-Americanism that goes up and down over the years, by the way, and it peaked in 2011 and then has gone down. And then a second sort of narrative, which policy can do less about, is the kind of narrative of us versus them. It's Pakistan versus America. It's sort of Muslims versus non-Muslims, and the West is out to get Pakistan. And this is sort of a narrative that has a particular group that sort of spouts it, Pakistan's Islamist parties and so on. Policy can do less about that narrative, but policy can do a little bit more about the sovereign nationalist narrative. So that's sort of my view of the relationship overall. Now, thinking about where we are at this current moment, and I'm aware that we are standing between you and lunch, and that I am standing between you and the question and answer session, and so I will speed it up a little bit. So I think the central question, and again, Ambassador Olson has sort of framed this for you all, is the militant group question. So the US wants Pakistan to stop its support of the Haqqani network, to stop its support of the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar-e-Taiba as well. That's sort of secondary, but that's still there. That sort of defines the relationship. That is the current bone of contention. And then the second is this is related to the first, in particular with the Haqqani network. What can Pakistan do to help resolve the war in Afghanistan? So if I can speak to the first, what is Pakistan going to do about these strategic militant assets that it has? Cutting off of aid did not accomplish anything, to no surprise. I mean, all of us were saying that, and it didn't really work, especially in a time when Pakistan has China to rely on, when Pakistan has Saudi Arabia to rely on, and especially in a time when its current prime minister is increasingly willing to and increasingly wants to rely on its neighbors as opposed to the West, because that is very much his that was his campaign promise, and that's what he fundamentally believes in. Until Pakistan sees the Haqqani network, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, as a fundamental existential threat to itself, it's not going to change its behavior. Nothing the US can do, no carrots, no sticks, nothing is going to help. It saw the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. For many years, it did not see it as an existential threat. It didn't do anything about it. Once it saw the TTP as an existential threat, Pakistan eliminated it by and large. There are fundamental sort of calculations that are still not enabling the Pakistani state to see these groups as more of a cost than a benefit. But there are certain things that are helping. I think the cutting off of US aid is not what is helping, but the Financial Action Task Force gray listing and now the imminent blacklisting. Pakistan really cares about its image and its perception in the world, and in particular, this prime minister and this administration in Pakistan cares because they want tourism. They want Pakistan to be seen as, as Pakistan shining rather than defined in terms of terrorism. So the Financial Action Task Force gray listing, I think helps there. Actions such as the one that China just took with blacklisting the leader of Jaish-e-Mohammed, Masood Azhar, at the UN Security Council, I think that can also help Pakistan change its incentives. But again, until it fundamentally realizes that these groups can merge with other groups that attack Pakistani citizens, and that these are not just groups that attack others, Pakistan won't change its behavior. And so, in some sense, we are at a place right now, after the hot words, the war of words on Twitter between Trump and Khan, we are at a place right now where Trump has also mellowed down, President Trump has mellowed down, Pakistan also is not focusing very much on the United States anymore. And so it's this point of low expectations, and ironically, perhaps this is perhaps the most productive point of this relationship. And so, Pakistan is sort of desensitized to the U.S. right now, and it may actually make decisions on its own for its own benefit that will in turn be better for everyone, rather than not really caving into U.S. pressure.
In fact, let me pick up on that excellent point, Madiha, and thank you very much, Madiha, for those great analysis. We have about 10 minutes left, so I do want to go quickly in a sort of lightning round fashion of, is this the moment where there could be a rapprochement? And please do address the personalities of the two leaders. If each of you could please take that on.
Okay, so you want?
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay. Well, two things. I'm going to be very candid. In terms of the two leaders, who are the two leaders we're talking about? Who actually leads Pakistan? I'm sorry, for the perspective of U.S. equities, I think that the deep state and the establishment and the Army really run most of the things that are of great interest to the United States. And I think that, my own personal analysis, for what it's worth, is that the Prime Minister of Pakistan runs a very narrow slice of Pakistan's governance. And in this case, it's primarily about the economy, energy, those sets of issues. And I think what GHQ wants out of the civilian government is economic performance, and that's a challenge right now. I mean, frankly, I think that Pakistan is going to have to go to the IMF. And I think it probably would have been better if that program had been done right after Imran Khan came in, which is usually the way it's been done over the past 2 cycles of democratic elections. On the broader question of rebalancing the relationship or putting on a new course, I think I agree with Madiha that I think there is not a moment of opportunity here. I think that there is some potentially a fairly narrow convergence of interests. What I would hope is that we basically can get off the roller coaster and not go on a big sort of upsurge in the relationship, whether that's in terms of assistance or cooperation that neither side really wants to do. And I agree entirely. If Pakistan, it would seem to me, if I were looking at this from the position of Pindi right now, I would think that Pakistan's strategic position was somewhat deteriorating. All of its neighbors it has problematic relations with. It's interesting, a lot of grief was given to the United States for our position on the airstrikes that followed Pulwana. But to the best of my knowledge, no one in the world condemned the Indian airstrikes into Pakistani territory. That's a strategic difficulty. Pakistan now has difficult relations with all its neighbors except China, but China is balancing its relationship between India and Pakistan. So I think, so I agree with Madiha that, there's a possibility for a narrow reset, but the more important question is what Pakistan decides to do for its own purposes.
And Shuja, what do you think the mood in the military is right now? Do they see this as a moment with the U.S. sending Zalmay Khalilzad to negotiate what seems like the end of the Afghan war, or at least a sense that that the U.S. is trying to look at an end game there? Is this a moment, or does the military just want to wait this period out?
I think a bit of both. And this has been historically the Pakistani military's position, that they know that they're going to remain in the neighborhood, even when the U.S. leaves. And therefore, they will hedge their bets. And I think there's agreement on the panel on that score. But they're also saying the right things. The question is, will they follow up by doing the right things? So, for instance, the Army Chief has said, and the Director General Inter-Services Public Relations Directorate repeated that, which is that the state must have the monopoly of power within the country. That means that, theoretically, you can't have the Afghan Taliban, whether the Haqqani group or other Afghan groups in the Balochistan area, as armed militants inside the borders of Pakistan. Neither can you have the Jaish-e-Mohammed or the Lashkar-e-Taiba. And the question is, what will they do about it? Both the civilian government and the military keep talking about being on the same page. This has been a repeat of what happened in the Kiani period when the civilian government when you asked them, would say we're on the same page on the war on militants. And to quote something I wrote at that time, I think it remains true. They may be on the same page, but it's different books. and the civilian government's book is a very narrow one. As Rick is saying, I don't think actually they have full control on the economic side either, because
fair enough.
Thankfully, and I say thankfully because the military is a huge part of the economy, it is now concerned about the fact that if the economic pie shrinks, then it affects the military much more than it affects everyone else, any other institution in the country. And I think that's an enlightening development if they go that route. So we have to wait to see. So where is the center of gravity? I think in Pakistan it is still divided. In the United States, the center of gravity, which was terribly divided in the Obama era, and we had 5 different wars being fought from the United States, and within Afghanistan we had 10 different wars. Different commanders that I've talked to told me there were 10 different wars being fought inside Afghanistan. Today, the center of gravity has shifted to the White House and to the National Security Council. There is no one at the DoD who is really making the kind of decisions that are needed. And state is really hanging on by its fingernails. And there is no leadership on the Hill, which is interested in foreign policy, it seems, except to cut. Just a quick point on aid. I don't think that aid is going to resume in a big way. I agree with Rick. Let me just share some numbers with you. Total aid to Pakistan in FY 2014 was $2,177,000,000, including CSF, of which at least half was CSF money. The next year it dropped to 1605. This was the year that Rick is talking about as being the height of the relationship, picking up again. Then it dropped to 1203 in 16, to 590 in 2017, 590 million. So from $1.2 billion to 590 million, then it dropped to 108 in 2018. And it's projected in 2020 to be at 70 million only. And 800 million of CSF money is still in arrears being withheld by the United States. So I don't see this golden lining, even with the Afghan dialogue and all the things that Zalmay Khalilzad may say, because I don't know whether he has a checkbook. And Rick was an SRAP, and Richard Holbrooke was an SRAP. The SRAP or special representatives don't have checkbooks. They can only do as well as they can based on what they're told. But 800 million of Pakistani money that was due to Pakistan is still being held by the United States. So there's a bit of blackmail going on here, but we also have to remember the calendar, that you are in the final few months of the Army Chief's tenure, and so there will be a change in Pakistan, most likely in November, and then the new Army Chief may have a very different perspective on this relationship.
And that will coincide with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs turning over here in the United States as well.
Just one quick observation on the numbers. I agree with your numbers, but what that doesn't take account of is the fact that there is $1 billion right now sitting in pipeline in economic support funds. You know, there's $1 billion that can be spent by the U.S. government in Pakistan on civilian assistance projects.
If the Pakistanis are capable of deploying it.
Thank you.
That's a big question.
Yes. I was going to say that, but I didn't. Yeah.
So, Madiha, we just have time for one last question, and then, and that is, what impact, if any, do you think listing the Jaish Mohammed at the UN, those sanctions, what will that have? Do you see any signs that Pakistan will respond, or will they just dig their heels in?
Sure. There's this vicious cycle that Pakistan responds just a little and then turns back. This time, there were some indications that things might be different because Pakistan sort of preemptively took over certain madrasas. It took over Jaish-e-Mohammed madrasas outside Lahore, but it just issued an order saying that nothing in those madrasas is going to change until further notice. So there's already indications of backsliding. And the appointment of this new interior minister that Pakistan has from a time when Pakistan did play a double game, Brigadier Ijaz Shah, that is a problem for sort of Pakistan convincing the world that it's going to actually change its behaviors when it comes to these groups. If I can very quickly just talk a little bit about just one or two points, picking up on.
We're just giving
sure, I know, absolutely. I think it's important to just right now the relationship is very transactional, and it's a relationship based on finding peace in Afghanistan, right? And in some ways, because there are low expectations, there are literally no promises. There's going to be less disappointment. And while Pakistan and the US are aligned in wanting there to be peace in Afghanistan, one has to think about what configurations of peace in Afghanistan would truly benefit Pakistan. So a configuration in which the Afghan Taliban emerges as the dominant power or in some kind of dominant role in Afghanistan will not be a configuration that benefits Pakistan. And that's something that we can talk about more after the fact. But those configurations need to be thought about. And so perhaps Pakistan might like to keep the conflict simmering at a low boiling temperature rather than resolved.
Well, with that excellent point, and I want to thank our panel because we do have lunch and we can carry on with questions and answers for our panelists at lunchtime so that we can stay on track. I want to thank you for joining me today and for addressing, we could speak all day about this incredible relationship, but thank you.